My brother got 20% of our family business at his graduation dinner 3 weeks earlier. I had finished my degree after 5 years of night classes, full-time work, and paying my own way when Aunt Diane asked, "What about Maeve?" Dad looked at me like he'd forgotten I was sitting. "Congratulations," he said. Then he turned to the waiter. "Bring us dessert." I stayed another hour while everyone toasted Ryan's future. Then I quietly left. I didn't go back. Not for Thanksgiving, not for Sunday dinner. Last month. Dad finally asked why. He had no idea what I had become while he wasn't looking. The restaurant was one of those places where the lights stayed low even before sunset and every table looked too polished to touch. Butter hissed from the kitchen. Red wine glowed beneath small lamps. My mother's perfume hung in the air like something sweet that had been sprayed too heavily. I was 29 that night. Ben sat beside me, close enough that our elbows touched whenever either of us reached for a glass. He knew how hard I had worked for my degree. He had seen me fall asleep over textbooks at midnight, wake before sunrise, and go straight back to work. Ryan sat near Dad at the center of the table. Of course he did. Dad had arranged the seating himself. Ryan wore a navy suit that probably cost more than my first semester of tuition. Ashley kept smoothing his sleeve and smiling like photographers were hiding behind the walls. Mom had already taken at least 20 pictures before the appetizers arrived. Then Dad stood. He tapped his spoon against his glass and started talking about legacy, about sacrifice, about carrying the Parker name forward. For several minutes, every sentence pointed toward Ryan. Dad praised his MBA, his ambition, his leadership, and the future he was going to build inside the family business. Ryan lowered his eyes at exactly the right moments, pretending to be humble while the corners of his mouth kept lifting. Then Dad reached beside his chair and brought out a leather folder. He slid it across the table. 20%, he said, for 1 second. Nobody moved. Then Ashley gasped. Mom covered her mouth. Ryan stared at the papers, then stood and hugged Dad while everyone applauded. I applauded too. That is, the part I still remember most clearly. I was genuinely trying to be happy for him. 3 weeks earlier, I had finished my own degree after 5 years of night classes while working full-time. There had been no dinner, no speech, no folder. Still, I told myself maybe Dad was waiting. Then Aunt Diane set down her wine glass. "What about Maeve?" The room changed. Dad looked toward me, and for one ridiculous second, my chest tightened with hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe he had something planned. He gave me a small smile. "Congratulations." "Maeve." Then he turned toward the waiter. "Let's see the dessert menu." A few people shifted in their chairs. Mom laughed softly and asked Ryan where he wanted to travel after graduation. Just like that. The conversation moved on. Ben's hand found mine beneath the table. I stared at the chocolate dessert placed in front of me later, watching the glossy center slowly collapse as it cooled. I never touched it. For almost another hour, I listened to Dad discuss Ryan's future as if mine did not exist. Then I stood, picked up my coat, and said, "I've got an early morning." Nobody tried to stop me. Outside, the cold air hit my face. Ben followed me to the car. And somewhere between that restaurant door and the parking lot, something inside me finally stopped waiting anymore. The truth is, Dad had been teaching me where I ranked in our family long before Ryan ever opened that leather folder. I was 18 the first time I understood it clearly. My grandparents had left money to help with college. Mine was supposed to be around $50,000, enough to keep me from starting adult life buried under loans. When I went to check the account before enrollment, most of it was gone. I remember standing in Dad's home office with the bank paperwork shaking in my hands. Where did it go? Dad barely looked up. Ryan needed help with his business. I thought I had misunderstood him. That was for school. He finally leaned back in his chair. Ryan needed an opportunity now. "You've always been resourceful." "Maeve, you'll figure something out." That sentence followed me for years. "You'll figure something out." Ryan's business folded before the year was over. No one asked him to replace the money. I changed my plans instead. I worked days, took classes at night, stretched grocery money, and learned how long cold coffee could sit beside a textbook before it became undrinkable. Some winter nights, I walked across a campus parking lot with Ohio snow soaking through my shoes and told myself this would all mean something eventually. Dad would see it. He had to. Then, a few years later, Ryan cost me something else. I had spent months building a relationship with a potential client. If the deal closed, my commission would have been around $40,000, enough to wipe out most of the debt I still carried. Ryan showed up at a community event where the client was present, drank too much, and turned a casual conversation into an embarrassing argument. By Monday, the client backed away. I went to my parents' house furious. Ryan sat on the couch looking annoyed that I had interrupted his evening. Mom stepped between us before I could finish. "He's under pressure. Maeve, he cost me $40,000. It was a mistake. He hasn't even apologized." Mom lowered her voice. "Don't make this bigger than it needs to be." That was always the rule. Ryan made the mess. I was expected to make the peace. So when I left that graduation dinner, I didn't go back. Thanksgiving came. Mom texted that there would be extra pie. I stayed home with Ben. Then came a Sunday dinner invitation. I ignored it. Weeks passed. Dad never called. Ryan never asked where I was. Mom sent casual messages about weather and neighborhood gossip, as if I were simply busy. The first people who actually confronted me were Ashley and my cousin Jake. They said I was jealous, petty, unable to celebrate Ryan's success. I read their messages twice and felt something strange. Not anger, relief, because I finally understood. They didn't miss me. They missed the version of me who never said no. A few months later, at work, I was reviewing industrial properties when one listing stopped me cold. I knew that warehouse. My father's business had depended on it for years. And suddenly, the past was sitting right there on my screen. I leaned closer, reading the price, the lease notes, and the location twice, for the first time. My family's world wasn't a source of pain. It was an investment opportunity. The listing stayed open on my screen long after everyone else in the office had gone home. The property was a large industrial complex on the edge of Columbus, close to the highway, with several warehouses and steady tenant demand. The asking price was about $15 million. One tenant occupied the largest building, my father's company. For a few seconds, I just stared. Then I forced myself to stop thinking like David Parker's daughter and start thinking like an investor. The location was strong, the loading access was excellent, comparable rents nearby had climbed steadily. Even if one tenant eventually left, the property could still work. Still, I knew exactly how this would look. So, the next morning, I walked into Thomas Reed's office and told him everything, not just that my family rented space there. Everything. The graduation dinner, Ryan, the money Dad had used years ago, the reason I had stopped going home. Thomas listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk. "If your family moved out tomorrow, would you still want this property?" I opened my mouth, then stopped. That question mattered. If my answer was no, this was revenge dressed up as business, so I went back to the numbers. For 3 days, I reviewed market rents, maintenance costs, vacancy rates, nearby development, highway access, and what it would take to divide the largest warehouse for future tenants. I slept badly. I drank too much coffee, and I kept asking myself the same question. Would I buy this if my last name were different? The answer was yes. Not emotionally, financially. When I showed Thomas the revised analysis, he studied it for several minutes, then he nodded. "Now we can talk." Thomas and a small group of investors provided most of the capital. I contributed what I could, along with the deal work and ongoing asset management. In return, I received a meaningful ownership stake and a real voice in major property decisions. We closed the purchase several months later. I did not call Dad, I did not text Ryan, I did not raise their rent. Their existing lease stayed exactly as written. Their employees came to work every morning without knowing anything had changed beyond the name on routine property notices. That mattered to me. I did not want to hurt warehouse workers, drivers, or office staff because I was angry at my family. So I waited. Months passed. Then the lease renewal date appeared on my calendar. I pulled the latest market numbers. My family's rent was roughly 20% below what similar industrial space was now bringing. For years, that cheap lease had quietly protected their margins. Now it was ending. I sat alone at my desk, staring at the renewal schedule. For almost a year, nobody in my family had really needed me. That was about to change, because this time, they were not coming to Maeve Parker, the daughter they overlooked. They were coming to the owner's table, and they still had no idea I was sitting there. They would learn that soon enough themselves. The renewal notice went out on a Monday morning. No family language, no personal note. Just the numbers. The old lease was expiring. Market rents had moved, if the company wanted to stay. The new agreement would bring the rent up gradually until it reached the current regional rate. By lunch, the responses started. Ryan sent the first angry email. He called the increase unreasonable. He talked about loyalty, history, and how long the company had occupied the warehouse. He demanded a meeting with whoever was really making these decisions. I read it twice, then I closed it. Dad handled the next messages more carefully. He asked for a review, then another conversation. That was when William Collins got involved. William had known Dad for years, but when he called my father after reviewing the ownership records and lease history, there was a long silence. The new ownership was legitimate, the lease was ending, the old rent was below market, and I had a real ownership and management role in the property. There was no trick to expose, no illegal pressure. Just a business problem Dad had ignored because the old arrangement had been comfortable. The meeting was scheduled for Friday. Dad knew I would be there. Ryan did not. He arrived carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the same confidence I had seen at his graduation dinner. William sat across from him. Outside the glass walls, downtown traffic moved below us like nothing mattered. I stood near the head of the table reviewing my notes when the door opened. Ryan walked in first. He saw me, stopped. Maeve, hi. Ryan. His eyes moved around the room. What are you doing here? I pulled out the chair across from me. Working. His face tightened. Where's management? You're looking at one of them. For once. Ryan had nothing to say. Dad entered behind him and quietly took a seat. I started the meeting. Not with the dinner. Not with the $50,000. Not with my degree. With the business. The company was bringing in about $4 million a year, but the debt load was above $2 million. Operating costs had climbed. Payments were heavier. Bills were rising. Cash flow was tighter than Ryan seemed to understand. He interrupted me. This company is fine. I looked at him. Then the market rent should not be a problem. That shut him up. I continued. The current lease had protected them for years because the rent was unusually low. The new ownership was not willing to keep subsidizing that gap. Ryan leaned forward. You know what this place means to us. I know exactly what it means. We're family. There it was. The word they always remembered when they needed something. I folded my hands. This is a business meeting. Ryan, you'll get your turn. His jaw tightened. A year earlier, I had sat at the end of a dinner table and waited for someone to give me a turn. Now I did not have to ask. I placed 2 proposals in front of them. The first let them stay. The rent would increase in stages, giving the company time to adjust before reaching the market level. The second gave them a reasonable transition period to relocate without punitive fees. Ryan stared at the pages. No family discount. Number. Dad finally looked at me. Maeve, what do you want for years? I could have answered that question instantly. I wanted him to be proud of me. I wanted him to admit what he had done. I wanted him to choose me once. But sitting there, none of that felt necessary. Nothing, I said. Dad looked confused. I'm not asking for your company. I'm not asking for Ryan's shares. I'm not asking you to apologize here. I pushed the proposals closer. I'm asking for the same rules everyone else gets. Nobody moved. Then I looked directly at Dad. A year ago. I needed you to see me. My voice stayed steady. I don't anymore. The room went still. And that was the moment I realized the power had never been the warehouse. It was walking into that room with nothing left to prove. Dad chose the first option. He signed a renewal that raised the rent in stages instead of all at once. The business stayed in the warehouse. Nobody lost a job, nobody got locked out. There was no dramatic collapse. What changed was the cushion. Ryan lost the company-paid car first, then some travel expenses. Then the private club membership he had treated like a birthright. Dad started reviewing every department budget himself, for the first time. Ryan had to justify what he spent and explain what he actually brought in. I heard all of that later through Diane. I didn't celebrate. That surprised me. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like to watch Ryan finally face consequences. It felt quieter than I expected. A week after the meeting, Mom called. Her voice had that careful softness she used whenever she wanted conflict to disappear without anyone admitting who caused it. "Maeve, we're still family." I looked out my kitchen window while Ben rinsed 2 coffee mugs behind me. "I know. Then why does everything have to feel so cold now?" I paused. "Mom, how many times did you tell Ryan we were family when he hurt me?" Silence. "How many times did you ask him to give something up so I could feel safe?" She didn't answer. That answer was enough. Ashley and Jake were louder. They told relatives I had used business leverage to punish my own family, but the story fell apart once people learned the terms. The rent was moving toward market rate. Dad had time to adjust. There were no special penalties. No one had been forced out. I didn't argue online. I didn't defend myself. For once. Facts did the work for me. Then, last month, Dad called. Not about the lease. Not about money. He just said, "Maeve, can I ask you something?" I almost laughed, because after nearly a year, that was the first time he had sounded unsure of whether he had the right. "Why haven't you come back?" I closed my eyes. I could smell that steakhouse again. Butter, wine, chocolate cooling untouched on a white plate. "It wasn't just dinner," I said. "I know." "No, you know the dinner. You don't know what it meant." I told him I had spent years believing that if I worked harder, achieved more, needed less, he would eventually see me the way he saw Ryan. I told him the dessert was not the reason I left. It was the moment I understood I had been waiting for something he might never know how to give. Dad was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if we could start over. "Maybe," I said, "but starting over means telling the truth about what happened first." That evening, Ben brought home 2 small chocolate desserts. I took one bite. No memory clung to it, and no old ache followed afterward either. And for the first time, it tasted like nothing but chocolate. I used to think winning would mean watching my father admit he underestimated me. It didn't. Winning was realizing his approval no longer controlled how I saw myself. Family love should not require one person to stay quiet. Stay small and keep absorbing the damage so everyone else can feel comfortable. Setting a boundary is not cruelty. Walking away is not always revenge. Sometimes it is simply self-respect. If you have ever had to stop chasing approval from your family, share your story in the comments and subscribe, because the next story may hit even closer to home.